The dust rose like copper clouds as the stagecoach rumbled into Taylorsville, Colorado. Carrying more than just passengers, it brought a melody that would change the town forever. Rose Blackburn clutched her violin case to her chest, as if it contained her very soul, her knuckles white against the worn leather that had traveled with her from Boston across 1,000 miles of American wilderness. The year was 1878, and Taylorsville sat nestled in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains, a settlement that had sprung up during the silver boom but now settled into the quiet rhythm of cattle and commerce. The main street consisted of little more than a general store, saloon, small hotel, and a smattering of other wooden buildings that seemed to lean against the wind that constantly swept down from the mountains. Rose stepped down from the stagecoach, her burgundy traveling dress immediately collecting the dust that seemed to coat everything in Taylorsville. At 23, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that belied the turmoil of the past year, the death of her parents, the foreclosure of their home, and the desperate journey west with nothing but her violin, and the promise of a teaching position that had dissolved like morning mist before she'd even arrived. "Miss, do you need help with your bags?" The stagecoach driver's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "I have only this," she replied, indicating her small carpet bag and the violin case, "and perhaps you might direct me to the boarding house." The driver pointed down the street. "Mrs. Peterson's place, just past the Mercantile. Can't miss it, only house with blue shutters in town." Rose nodded her thanks and began walking, aware of the curious stares from the townspeople. A woman traveling alone was unusual enough, one with a violin case even more so. But Rose had learned to steel herself against the judgment of strangers. Her music was all she had left, and it would have to be enough. Thomas Sutton noticed the newcomer from where he stood outside the livery stable. At 30, he'd spent most of his life in the saddle, working cattle on his small ranch outside of town. The last 10 years had hardened him into the man the locals respected: quiet, fair, and as solid as the mountains themselves. His faded blue shirt was rolled up at the sleeves, revealing tanned forearms corded with muscle from years of hard work. The hat he wore was beaten by sun and rain, but still served its purpose, shading eyes that had seen their share of both beauty and hardship on the frontier. There was something in the way she carried herself, a mixture of determination and vulnerability, that made him watch her progress down the street. The violin case especially caught his attention. Music was a rare thing in Taylorsville, usually limited to a tinny piano at the Silver Dollar Saloon or the occasional traveling show that might pass through once a year. "New arrival?" asked Jeb, the aging blacksmith whose shop adjoined the livery. "Appears so," Thomas replied, his voice low. "Carrying a violin." Jeb spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Won't last long here. This ain't no place for fancy music." Thomas said nothing, but as he watched Rose disappear into Mrs. Peterson's boarding house, he found himself disagreeing. Perhaps Taylorsville was exactly the place that needed a little music. Rose found Mrs. Peterson to be a widow of about 50 with sharp eyes but a kind smile. The boarding house was clean if sparse, and the room she was offered was small but private. "It's $2 a week, includes breakfast and supper," Mrs. Peterson explained, showing her to a narrow room with a single bed, washstand, and small chest of drawers. "No gentlemen callers allowed upstairs, and I lock the front door at 9 sharp." "That's perfectly agreeable," Rose said, setting her violin case carefully on the bed. "I wonder, Mrs. Peterson, if you might know of any employment opportunities in town. I had arranged to teach music at the school, but I received word on my journey that the position has been filled." Mrs. Peterson's face softened with sympathy. "Oh dear, That's Sheriff Wilson's doing, I expect. His niece arrived from Denver last month, and suddenly she was the new music teacher. She shook her head. There's the mercantile Mr. Granger sometimes needs help, or perhaps the hotel. They serve meals and might need someone in the kitchen. Thank you. I'll inquire tomorrow. Rose managed a smile, though her heart sank at the prospect. She had not come all this way to wash dishes or stock shelves, but necessity had a way of reshaping dreams. That evening, after a simple supper of bean soup and cornbread shared with the boarding house's 3 other residents, an elderly bookkeeper, a young clerk from the bank, and a seamstress, Rose returned to her room. The weight of uncertainty pressed on her, but as always, she turned to her violin for solace. She opened the case reverently, lifting out the instrument that had been her grandfather's. It was not particularly valuable by a connoisseur's standards, but its tone was warm, and in Rose's hands, it sang with a voice that had moved audiences in Boston's finest parlors. Rose tucked it under her chin and drew the bow across the strings. The first notes of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, arranged for violin, filled the small room. She closed her eyes, letting the music wash away her worries, if only for a moment. Outside her window, on the street below, Thomas Sutton had been walking back to his horse after a meeting with the mercantile owner. The sound stopped him in his tracks. The melody floated down like something from another world, too beautiful, too refined for this rough-hewn town. He stood there, hat in hand, until the music finally ceased. Morning brought Rose to the mercantile, where Mr. Granger regretfully informed her he had no positions available. The hotel kitchen was similarly fully staffed. By midday, she had exhausted her limited options in the small town and found herself sitting on a bench outside the general store, contemplating what to do next. "You're the one with the violin." Rose looked up to find a tall man standing before her, his hat in his hands. The sun was behind him, casting his face in shadow, but she could make out strong features weathered by the elements. "Yes," she replied, unsure if this was an accusation or an observation. "I heard you playing last night, from the street." Thomas shifted his weight, suddenly feeling awkward. He wasn't a man accustomed to approaching strangers, especially not women from the East with refined talents. It was good, real good. "Thank you," Rose said, surprised by the compliment. "I'm Thomas Sutton. I ranch outside of town." He extended a calloused hand, which she took briefly. "Rose Blackburn, recently of Boston, currently of Mrs. Peterson's boarding house." She attempted a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "You looking for work, Miss Blackburn? I saw you going around town today." "Yes." "Unfortunately, the teaching position I came for has been filled, and there seems to be little else available." Thomas nodded, turning his hat in his hands as he considered something. "Folks around here don't get much chance for entertainment, or culture." "Might be they'd pay to hear someone who can play like you do." Rose blinked, considering this. "A recital, you mean? I hadn't thought. Is there a suitable venue in town?" Thomas shook his head. "Not exactly. The church is small and Pastor Jenkins is particular about what happens there. The saloon has a piano, but—" He trailed off, both of them understanding that a saloon was no place for a lady to perform. "I see." "Well, thank you for the thought, Mr. Sutton." "Thomas," he corrected. Then, as if the idea had just occurred to him, "I could build you a stage." "I beg your pardon, a stage, for playing your violin. Out at my ranch I've got a big barn. It'd be easy enough to build a proper platform. We could put out words, sell tickets maybe. Split whatever comes in." He rushed the words as if afraid he'd lose his nerve if he slowed down. Rose stared at him, trying to determine if he was serious or if this was some kind of frontier joke at her expense. His expression was earnest, those blue eyes direct and clear. "Why would you do that for a complete stranger?" Thomas looked away, across the dusty main street toward the mountains that framed the town. "Music like yours doesn't come through Taylorsville often. Seems a shame to waste it." He paused. "And you need work. I need. Well, my ranch could use some attention that doesn't involve cattle." Rose considered the offer. It was unorthodox, certainly. In Boston, she had performed in proper concert halls and society parlors. The idea of playing in a barn on a makeshift stage seemed almost comical. But there was something in the man's straightforward manner that inspired trust. "I would need to see this barn of yours before agreeing to anything," she said finally. A ghost of a smile touched Thomas's lips. "Of course. I can bring a wagon tomorrow if that suits." And so, the next morning, Rose found herself seated beside Thomas on the bench of a wagon, her violin case secured carefully behind them as they traveled the 5 miles to his ranch. The land opened up beyond the town, revealing rolling hills dotted with stands of pine and aspen. In the distance, cattle grazed in meadows still green from the spring rains. Thomas's ranch was modest but well kept. The main house was a solid log structure with a stone chimney, and nearby stood a large barn, a bunkhouse, and various outbuildings. A small creek wound through the property, bordered by cottonwoods that provided welcome shade. "It's lovely," Rose said sincerely as Thomas helped her down from the wagon. "Been working it for 8 years now," he replied, a note of pride in his voice. "Started with just 10 head of cattle and this patch of land. Now I've got nearly 100 head and 3 hired hands to help manage them." He showed her the barn, first a spacious structure with high rafters that Rose immediately noted would create interesting acoustics. One end was used for storing hay, while horse stalls lined one side. The center area was open and swept clean. "I was thinking here," Thomas said, gesturing to the open space. "Build a platform about a foot high, maybe 8 by 8 feet. Enough room for you and maybe a few others if you ever wanted to bring in more musicians." He pointed upward. "Could hang lanterns from the rafters for evening performances, and there's plenty of room for folks to sit." Rose walked the space, imagining it transformed. It could work. The barn was surprisingly clean for a working ranch, and the open doors would provide both light and ventilation. "You would really go to all this trouble?" she asked, turning back to Thomas. He shrugged, a gesture she was beginning to recognize as his way of minimizing his own generosity. "It's not much trouble. I've got the lumber and my hands can help when they're not busy with the cattle. And why would people come all the way out here to listen to me play?" "Because there's precious little beauty out here, Miss Blackburn. People are hungry for it, even if they don't know it yet." There was something in the way he said it quietly, almost to himself, that made Rose see Thomas Sutton differently. This wasn't just a business proposition from a rancher with an empty barn. This was something more personal. "Very well, Mr. Sutton. Thomas," he reminded her again. "Thomas," she corrected herself with a small smile. "I accept your proposal. When do you imagine this stage might be completed?" "Give me a week. We'll have your first performance next Saturday evening. That'll give us time to spread the word." And true to his word, Thomas set to work immediately. Rose returned to town that afternoon with a lightness in her step she hadn't felt since leaving Boston. She spent the next days preparing a program suitable for a frontier audience, a mixture of classical pieces, folk tunes, and popular melodies that might be recognized even in this remote corner of Colorado. Every other day, Thomas came to town with updates on the progress. The stage was taking shape. His ranch hands, initially skeptical, had become invested in the project. Word was spreading about the violin lady who would be performing at the Sutton Ranch. On the 5th day, He arrived at the boarding house with an unexpected proposal. "Mrs. Peterson," he addressed the landlady who was sweeping the front porch. "I was hoping Miss Blackburn might be allowed to come out to the ranch today. The stage is nearly finished, and it would be good for her to try it out before Saturday." Mrs. Peterson gave him a measuring look. Thomas Sutton was well respected in Taylorsville, known to be honorable and hardworking. Still, propriety had to be maintained. "I'll fetch her," she said, disappearing inside. Rose appeared moments later, violin case in hand. "The stage is ready, nearly. Thought you might want to test the acoustics, make sure everything is to your liking." Mrs. Peterson cleared her throat meaningfully. "Miss Blackburn, while I have no objection to you visiting Mr. Sutton's ranch for professional purposes, it would be improper for you to go unchaperoned." Rose's face fell slightly. "Of course. I hadn't thought I'd be happy to accompany you," came a voice from inside the house. Sarah Miller, the seamstress who also boarded at Mrs. Peterson's, stepped onto the porch. At 26, she was considered a respectable chaperone. "I've been curious about this musical venture myself." And so the three of them made their way to the Sutton Ranch, where Rose was amazed to see the transformation that had taken place. The stage was exactly as Thomas had described, a sturdy platform raised about a foot off the ground. Its pine boards sanded smooth and treated with linseed oil that gave them a warm glow. Around it, bales of hay had been arranged as seating, covered with clean blankets to make them more comfortable. Lanterns hung from the rafters, ready to be lit for the evening performance. "It's perfect," Rose breathed, stepping onto the stage. The boards felt solid beneath her feet, with just enough spring to be comfortable for standing through a performance. "Try it out," Thomas urged, a rare full smile crossing his face at her obvious pleasure. Rose opened her violin case and lifted out the instrument. After a brief tuning, she began to play a lively reel that filled the barn with sound. The acoustics were surprisingly good, the high ceiling allowing the notes to soar and resonate. When she finished, even Sarah applauded enthusiastically. "It's wonderful, Rose. I had no idea you played so beautifully." Thomas said nothing, but the look of quiet satisfaction on his face spoke volumes. He had built more than just a stage. He had created a space where Rose's talent could shine. As they prepared to return to town, Thomas pulled Rose aside while Sarah examined some wildflowers near the wagon. "Is there anything else you need?" "For the performance," Rose considered. "Perhaps some programs, simple ones just listing the pieces I'll be playing, and it might be nice to have some refreshments for the audience afterward." "I'll see to it," he promised. Saturday arrived with clear skies and mild weather, perfect for an evening of music. Thomas sent his wagon to bring Rose to the ranch early, along with Mrs. Peterson and Sarah, who had both offered to help with final preparations. By 6 o'clock, wagons and riders began arriving from town and surrounding ranches. Thomas had spread the word widely, but even he seemed surprised by the turnout. Nearly 50 people gathered in the barn, settling onto the hay bale seating with an air of curious anticipation. Many were dressed in their Sunday best, treating the occasion like the special event it was. Sheriff Wilson was there, along with his niece, the woman who had taken Rose's teaching position. The mercantile owner, the banker and his wife, ranch families from miles around, and even a few cowboys still dusty from the trail had come to hear the music. Thomas had arranged everything meticulously. Programs printed at the newspaper office were handed to each guest. A table near the barn door held a punch bowl and plates of cookies contributed by Mrs. Peterson. The lanterns cast a warm glow over the scene as twilight deepened outside. Rose waited in the small tack room that Thomas had cleared out as a makeshift dressing room. She wore her best dress, a deep blue silk with modest lace at the collar and cuffs. Her hair was arranged simply but elegantly, and around her neck hung a small silver locket containing miniatures of her parents, her only remaining connection to them. Thomas knocked softly on the door. "Miss Blackburn, everyone seated, whenever you're ready." She opened the door, and for a moment he seemed at a loss for words. In the lantern light, with her violin in hand and anticipation bringing color to her cheeks, Rose looked transformed from the dusty, uncertain traveler who had stepped off the stagecoach just over a week ago. "You look very nice," he managed finally. "Thank you, Thomas, for everything." She smiled up at him, suddenly aware of how tall he was, how the clean shirt and vest he wore for the occasion suited his broad shoulders. He nodded, seeming almost embarrassed by her gratitude. "They're waiting. I'll introduce you." Rose took a deep breath and followed him. As they approached the stage, conversation died down and all eyes turned to them. Thomas stepped onto the platform first, clearing his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming tonight. I'm pleased to present Miss Rose Blackburn, recently arrived from Boston, who has kindly agreed to share her talents with us. Miss Blackburn." He extended his hand to help her onto the stage, then stepped back, leaving her alone in the pool of lantern light. For a moment, Rose felt a flutter of panic. These people were strangers, their expectations unknown. But then she looked out and saw their faces eager, hopeful, ready to be transported by music many of them rarely had the chance to hear. She raised her violin, tucked it under her chin, and began to play. The first piece was Bach's air on the G string, serene, dignified, a gentle introduction for ears perhaps unaccustomed to classical music. The rich tones filled the barn, and Rose could see the audience leaning forward, captivated by the sound. She followed with livelier pieces, a folk dance, an Irish jig that had several children bouncing in their seats. Then came the emotional heart of her program. Schubert's Ave Maria, played with such feeling that several women dabbed at their eyes. Throughout it all, she was aware of Thomas standing at the back of the barn, his tall figure silhouetted against the open doors, watching her with an intensity that made her heart beat a little faster between pieces. For her final selection, Rose had chosen Beautiful Dreamer, the Stephen Foster ballad that had been popular before the war and remained a favorite. As she played the familiar melody, she noticed several people humming along softly. When the last note faded, there was a moment of silence, that precious space between the end of music and the return to reality. Then the applause began, enthusiastic and genuine, with several people rising to their feet. Rose curtsied, overwhelmed by the response. As she looked out at the audience, she caught Thomas's eye. He wasn't applauding. He was simply standing there, a smile on his face that seemed to contain something deeper than mere satisfaction at a successful event. After the performance, the audience lingered, eager to speak with Rose and enjoy the refreshments. Many asked if there would be another concert soon. The sheriff's niece approached somewhat sheepishly, introducing herself as Emily Wilson. "Your playing is magnificent, Miss Blackburn. I feel rather guilty now about the teaching position. I had no idea." "Please don't concern yourself," Rose assured her. "Things have a way of working out as they should." As she said it, Rose realized she was beginning to believe it. Had she secured the teaching position, she would never have met Thomas Sutton, never experienced the joy of playing for this appreciative audience in this most unlikely of venues. The crowd eventually dispersed, wagons and riders disappearing into the night until only Rose, Thomas, and his 3 ranch hands remained. The hands Miguel, a skilled Mexican vaquero, Caleb, a former Union soldier with a quiet demeanor, and young Jamie, barely 18 and eager to learn the ranching trade, helped clear away the refreshments and douse most of the lanterns. "We'll take care of the rest, boss," Miguel said with a knowing smile as the three men retreated to the bunkhouse, leaving Rose and Thomas alone in the barn. "It was a success beyond my expectations," Rose said, carefully placing her violin in its case. "I cannot thank you enough." Thomas moved closer, his boots quiet on the wooden stage. "No need for thanks. The townspeople were grateful for the music. Been too long since there was something like this in Taylorsville." "We should do it again," she suggested. "Perhaps make it a monthly event." "I could prepare new programs. I'd like that," he interrupted softly. "Very much." There was something in his voice that made Rose look up. In the dim light of the remaining lanterns, his face was half in shadow, but his eyes were clear and direct. "You're playing." He began, then paused, searching for words. Thomas Sutton was not a man accustomed to expressing his feelings. "It made me think of things I haven't thought about in a long time. Beautiful things." "Music has that power," Rose said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It reminds us of what matters." Thomas nodded, taking a step closer. "When I first saw you get off that stagecoach with your violin case and your city clothes, I thought you wouldn't last a week in Taylorsville." Rose laughed softly. "A reasonable assumption. I'm glad to be proven wrong." His hand reached out hesitantly and touched hers where it rested on the violin case. The contact was brief but electric. "I should get you back to town. Mrs. Peterson will be locking the door soon." The ride back to Taylorsville was quiet, the night air cool around them. Rose felt a curious mix of elation from the performance, and something else, a warmth that had nothing to do with music and everything to do with the man beside her, guiding the horses through the darkness. At the boarding house, Thomas helped her down from the wagon, his hands strong and sure at her waist. "Good night, Miss Blackburn." "Rose," she corrected him with a smile. "After all this, I think you should call me Rose." "Rose," he repeated as if testing the name. "Good night then, Rose." "Good night, Thomas." As the weeks passed, the musical performances at Sutton Ranch became a regular event. Once a month, Rose would prepare a new program, and the barn would fill with eager listeners. Word spread beyond Taylorsville, bringing visitors from as far as Denver for the concerts. Between performances, Rose found other ways to support herself. Several families in town engaged her to give music lessons to their children. She also began playing at Sunday services at the small church, where Pastor Jenkins discovered her piano skills were as accomplished as her violin playing. But it was the time spent at the ranch that Rose treasured most. Thomas would send his wagon for her several times a week, ostensibly to practice in the barn with its superior acoustics. But increasingly, their time together extended beyond music. He showed her the beauty of the land he loved, riding together to a high meadow carpeted with wildflowers, teaching her to fish in the clear creek that ran through his property, introducing her to the gentle-eyed cattle that were his livelihood. In turn, Rose brought a softness to the rugged ranch. Fresh curtains appeared in the windows of the main house. The garden, which had been little more than a few hardy vegetables, now bloomed with flowers. The evening meal, once a hasty affair of beans and whatever meat was available, became a time for conversation and laughter when Rose joined them. The ranch hands watched the developing relationship with knowing smiles, but kept their observations to themselves. It was enough that their taciturn boss now whistled while he worked and found reasons to return to the main house throughout the day when Miss Blackburn was visiting. By late summer, it was common knowledge in Taylorsville that Thomas Sutton was courting Rose Blackburn. Mrs. Peterson relaxed her rules about gentlemen callers, allowing Thomas to sit with Rose on the front porch in the evenings when he came to town. On Sundays after church, they would often be seen walking together, her hand resting lightly on his arm. It was during one such walk in early September that Thomas finally spoke of his past. "I was married once," he said quietly as they strolled along the creek that wound through the edge of town. "Her name was Elizabeth. She came out here with me from Missouri when I was just starting the ranch." Rose had heard whispers. Of course the small town had few secrets, but she had waited for Thomas to share this part of himself. "What happened?" she asked gently. "Childbirth fever." "Her and the baby both." His voice was steady, but Rose could feel the tension in the arm beneath her hand. "It was our second year here. Doctor was 3 days' ride away. By the time I got back with him, it was too late." Rose stopped walking, turning to face him. "I'm so sorry, Thomas." He nodded, looking out over the water rather than at her. "For a long time, I thought that was it for me. Just the ranch and the cattle until I got too old to work them anymore." He finally met her eyes. "Then you stepped off that stagecoach with your violin." Rose reached up to touch his cheek, rough with the day's stubble. "And you built me a stage." "Seemed like the thing to do," he said with a small smile, covering her hand with his own. "It changed everything," she whispered. Thomas leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. When she didn't, he pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that was gentle but filled with promise. When they parted, Rose's heart was racing. In Boston, she had received her share of attention from young men, but none had affected her the way Thomas Sutton did with just a look or a touch. "I'm not a cultured man, Rose," he said, still holding her hand against his face. "I can't give you opera houses or fancy dinner parties, but I can promise you this. Every day I'll try to build something beautiful for you just like that stage." "That's all I could ever want," she replied, and knew it was true. The autumn brought change to Taylorsville. A traveling theater company passed through, staying for 2 weeks and performing in the town hall. The lead actress, upon hearing of Rose's concerts at Sutton Ranch, asked to attend the next one. "My dear," she said to Rose afterward, "you are wasting your talent in this backwater. With your skills, you could perform in San Francisco, even New York." Rose thanked her politely, but knew she had no desire to leave. The thought of returning to city life, away from the mountains and meadows, away from Thomas, held no appeal. Yet the actress's words planted a seed of doubt. Was she being selfish, keeping her music for this small corner of Colorado? Did she owe it to her art to seek a wider audience? Thomas noticed her preoccupation as they rode back to town after the performance. "Something troubling you?" Rose hesitated, then shared the actress's comments. "I wonder sometimes if I'm meant to be doing more with my music." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, the only sound the steady clip-clop of the horse's hooves and the creak of the wagon. "You want to leave Taylorsville?" he finally asked, his voice carefully neutral. "No," she said quickly, then more thoughtfully. "At least, I don't think so." "But what if staying means I'm not fulfilling my potential?" Thomas guided the horses around a bend in the road before responding. "My pa used to say that potential is like a seed. It can grow in all sorts of soil as long as it's tended right." He glanced at her. "Seems to me your music is growing just fine here. People come from all over to hear you play now." "That's true," Rose acknowledged, "and I've never felt more connected to my audience than I do here." "But," Thomas prompted, hearing the hesitation in her voice. "But I worry that someday I might regret not trying for something more." Thomas nodded slowly. "That's fair. A person should chase their dreams." He paused. "Even if it takes them away from what they've found." The weight of what remained unspoken hung between them. In the months since her arrival, Rose had become intertwined with life in Taylorsville, with the children she taught, with Mrs. Peterson and the other boarders who had become friends, with the congregation that appreciated her Sunday playing. most of all with Thomas and the future that seemed to be unfolding between them. "I don't know what I want," she admitted softly. "You don't have to decide tonight," Thomas said, reaching over to cover her hand with his. "Whatever you choose, I'll understand." But as the wagon rolled into town, Rose couldn't help but wonder if that was true. Could Thomas really understand if she chose to leave? Could she forgive herself if she stayed only for him, setting aside greater ambitions? The question haunted her in the days that followed. She went through her routines, giving lessons, practicing for the next concert, joining Thomas for Sunday dinner at the ranch, but part of her mind was always turning over the possibilities, weighing dreams against reality. It was Mrs. Peterson who finally forced the issue, in her direct way. "That rancher of yours came by with these while you were out," she said one afternoon, handing Rose a small bouquet of late-blooming wildflowers. "Had the look of a man with something important on his mind." Rose fingered the delicate purple blooms. "Did he say when he'd return?" "Said he'd be in town tomorrow on business." Mrs. Peterson gave her a knowing look. "Girl, I've seen the way you two circle around each other. He's going to ask you to marry him if I'm any judge of men, and I am." "Oh," Rose said softly, her heart racing at the thought. "The question is, what will you say?" Mrs. Peterson folded her arms. "Because if you're still thinking of leaving Taylorsville, you'd best let that poor man know before he puts his heart on the line." That night, Rose couldn't sleep. She sat by her window, looking out at the stars that seemed so much brighter here than they had in Boston. In her hands, she held her violin, though she didn't play, mindful of the other boarders sleeping nearby. What did she truly want? The acclaim and opportunities of a bigger city? Or the life she had begun to build here, simpler perhaps, but rich in its own way? By morning, she knew her answer. Thomas arrived in town just after noon. His business at the bank concluded quickly. He found Rose waiting on the porch of the boarding house, her violin case beside her. "I thought we might go to the ranch," she said as he approached. "There's something I'd like to discuss with you." Thomas nodded, helping her into the wagon. They rode in companionable silence, the familiar landscape rolling past. Rose noticed the leaves beginning to turn on the aspens, touches of gold among the green that would soon spread across the mountainsides. At the ranch, Thomas led her not to the barn but to a small rise behind the main house. A single pine tree stood there, offering shade and a view of the property stretching out below. "This is where I come to think," he explained, spreading a blanket on the ground beneath the tree. "Seemed like a good place for talking." They sat side by side, looking out over the ranch, the barn where Rose had played so many concerts, the creek winding silver through the pastures, cattle grazing peacefully in the distance. The mountains rose beyond, eternal and steadfast. "I've been thinking about what the actress said," Rose began, "about my potential and where I should be playing." Thomas nodded, his face giving nothing away. "And what have you decided?" Rose turned to him, taking his rough hands in her smaller ones. "I've decided that potential isn't just about how many people hear you or how famous you become. It's about the difference you make, the joy you bring." She smiled. "And I've never brought more joy with my music than I have here, playing in a barn on a stage built by a cowboy." Thomas's eyes widened slightly. "You're staying in Taylorsville." "If there's a reason for me to stay," she replied softly. The tension seemed to leave his body all at once. "Rose Blackburn, I've been carrying something around for weeks, waiting for the right moment." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. "I'm not one for fancy words, but I know what I feel." He opened the pouch and tipped a ring into his palm, a simple gold band with a small diamond that caught the afternoon sunlight. "I love you, Rose. Your music first, maybe, but then everything else about you. Your kindness to the children you teach. Your courage in coming out here alone, the way you see beauty in things I took for granted." He took a breath. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Rose's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, Thomas. Yes, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into an embrace that felt like coming home. Their kiss sealed a promise not just of marriage, but of a life built together, note by note, day by day. The wedding took place in late October, when the aspens were at their golden peak. The small church in Taylorsville could barely contain the guests. It seemed everyone in the county wanted to witness the union of the violin lady and the rancher who had built her a stage. Rose wore a dress of ivory silk that Sarah the seamstress had worked on for weeks, incorporating lace from Rose's mother's wedding gown that had been carefully packed in her trunk. Her violin rested on a special stand near the altar, not to be played during the ceremony, but present nonetheless, a symbol of what had brought them together. Thomas stood tall in a new black suit, his normally unruly hair tamed for the occasion, his face clean-shaven. His 3 ranch hands served as groomsmen, each polished and proud to stand beside the man they respected. Pastor Jenkins spoke of harmony and partnership, of how 2 different lives could come together to create something more beautiful than either could alone, like notes blending in a chord. When Rose and Thomas exchanged their vows, their voices were clear and certain, carrying to the back of the church without hesitation. Afterward, the celebration moved to Sutton Ranch, where the barn had been transformed yet again. The stage remained, but the space around it had been cleared for dancing. Tables laden with food lined one wall, contributions from every family in Taylorsville, a community's blessing on the new couple. As twilight descended, lanterns were lit, casting a golden glow over the gathering. Music came from a small ensemble of players. Rose had discovered and encouraged in the surrounding areas a fiddler from a neighboring ranch, a flautist who worked at the bank, even Sheriff Wilson's niece on piano, transported to the barn for the occasion. Thomas led Rose to the center of the floor for their first dance as husband and wife. He moved with surprising grace for a man who spent most of his days in the saddle. "Where did you learn to dance so well?" Rose asked as he guided her smoothly through a waltz. "Been practicing," he admitted with a grin. "Miguel's wife has been teaching me when you were in town giving lessons. Wanted to do right by you today." Rose laughed, delighted by this revelation. Another surprise from Thomas Sutton. Will they never cease? "Not if I can help it," he promised, pulling her closer as they swayed to the music. Later in the evening, at the community's insistence, Rose took to the stage one more time. Standing there in her wedding dress, she lifted her violin and played not a classical piece or a folk tune, but a simple melody she had composed herself, a love song for Thomas, for Taylorsville, for the life they would build together. As the last notes faded, she looked out at the faces of her new family and community, finally coming to rest on Thomas. In his eyes, she saw everything she needed to know. She had made the right choice. Her potential would unfold here in this unlikely place with this extraordinary man. Winter settled over Taylorsville with a quiet beauty. Snow blanketed the mountains and fields, transforming the landscape into a glistening expanse of white. The Sutton Ranch stood like an island in the sea of snow, smoke curling from the chimney of the main house where Rose and Thomas had begun their life together. Marriage brought adjustments for both of them. Rose learned the rhythms of ranch life, the early mornings, the constant work, the satisfaction of seeing immediate results from one's labor. Thomas discovered the pleasure of evenings spent by the fire while Rose played her violin, of waking to the smell of fresh bread baking, of having someone with whom to share both burdens and joys. The monthly concerts continued through the winter. though less frequently due to the difficulties of travel in the snow. The barn was heated by several large stoves, and those who made the journey were rewarded with mulled cider and Rose's music, which seemed to take on new depth and emotion since her marriage. "Your playing has changed," Emily Wilson commented after a February performance. "It's always been technically perfect, but now it reaches right into the soul." Rose smiled, glancing across the barn to where Thomas was speaking with some of the ranchers who had attended. "I suppose I have more to say with my music now." Spring brought renewal to the land, and a surprise to the Sutton household. Rose had suspected for several weeks, but confirmed it with a visit to the doctor in Denver during a trip to purchase supplies. She waited until they returned to the ranch, until the evening when they were alone by the fire, to share the news. "Thomas," she said, setting aside her mending, "I have something to tell you." He looked up from the ledger where he had been calculating the spring calving numbers. "What is it?" "We're going to have a child. In late September, the doctor thinks." Thomas stared at her for a long moment, the ledger forgotten. Then he was on his knees beside her chair, gathering her hands in his. "A baby," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Are you certain?" Rose nodded, her own eyes filling with tears at the wonder in his face. "Quite certain." He pressed his forehead against their joined hands, and she felt him tremble slightly. She knew he was thinking of Elizabeth and the child he had lost, of the grief that had nearly broken him. "It will be different this time," she said softly, running her fingers through his hair. "Dr. Henderson is planning to be in Denver all summer, and Taylorsville has grown. There's talk of a full-time doctor coming by year's end." Thomas looked up, his eyes suspiciously bright. "I'm not afraid," he said, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. "Not with you." As her pregnancy progressed, Rose continued to teach and play, though she scaled back her performances as summer's heat made travel more difficult. The stage Thomas had built her stood ready in the barn, a reminder of how their story had begun, waiting for the day when she would return to it. In August, Rose's parents' old friends from Boston arrived for an extended visit. The Whitfields, who had written when they heard of Rose's marriage and impending motherhood. Eleanor and James Whitfield had been like an aunt and uncle to Rose growing up, and their presence in these final weeks of waiting was a comfort. "I must admit, when we received your letter about marrying a Colorado rancher, we were concerned," Eleanor confessed as she and Rose sat on the porch, shelling peas. "We imagined some rough character who wouldn't appreciate your talents." Rose laughed. "And now?" Eleanor glanced toward the corral, where Thomas and James were deep in conversation, the older man clearly fascinated by Thomas's explanation of cattle breeding practices. "Now I see a man who adores you, who has built a good life, and who happens to understand the value of music even if he doesn't play himself." She patted Rose's hand. "Your parents would approve, my dear." The baby arrived on a perfect September day, with the aspens beginning their annual transformation to gold. Despite all preparations and precautions, there was no time to send for the doctor in Denver. The child came quickly, with only Mrs. Peterson summoned from town by a frantic ranch hand and Eleanor Whitfield to assist. Thomas paced outside the bedroom door, each of Rose's cries piercing him like a physical blow. The memories of another September, another birth, threatened to overwhelm him. But then came a new sound, the indignant wail of a healthy infant taking its first breath. The door opened, and Eleanor emerged, her face tired but beaming. "You have a son, Mr. Sutton, a beautiful, strong boy." Thomas entered the bedroom on unsteady legs. Rose lay propped against pillows, her face flushed and damp with perspiration but radiant with joy. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. "Come meet your son," she said, her voice weary but triumphant. Thomas sat carefully on the edge of the bed, afraid to disturb either of them. Rose turned back the blanket to reveal a small, red face framed by wispy dark hair Thomas's coloring, but with Rose's delicate features. "Would you like to hold him?" she asked. Hesitantly, Thomas reached out. Rose placed the baby in his arms, showing him how to support the head. The infant squirmed slightly, then settled, one tiny hand escaping the blanket to curl reflexively around Thomas's finger. "He's perfect," Thomas whispered, overwhelmed by the surge of love he felt for this new life, their life, created together. "What shall we call him?" Rose asked. Thomas thought for a moment. "William," he said, "after my father, William Thomas Sutton." "William," Rose repeated, testing the name. "I like it. Hello, William." The baby opened his eyes at the sound of his mother's voice, dark blue eyes that would eventually lighten to match his father's. In that moment, looking down at his son and across at his wife, Thomas Sutton knew a completeness he had never thought possible. The ranch, the music, the love between them, all of it had led to this, a family forged from unlikely beginnings. The years that followed brought changes to Taylorsville and to Sutton Ranch. The town grew as the railroad extended a spur line, bringing new businesses and residents. Rose's concerts became a cultural fixture, drawing visitors from Denver and beyond. She expanded the programs to include other musicians and occasionally vocal performances, turning the barn into what locals proudly called the Sutton Music Hall. William grew into a sturdy boy with his father's love of the land and his mother's ear for music. By the time he was 5, he was taking violin lessons from Rose, his small fingers surprisingly deft on the strings. A sister joined him when he was 3, Catherine Eleanor Sutton, named for both grandmothers, a lively girl with strawberry blonde curls and a laugh that echoed across the ranch. The stage Thomas had built remained the center of their shared world, though it was expanded and improved over time. New plank flooring replaced the original boards. Proper seating was installed instead of hay bales. A small dressing room was added to one side. But the essence remained the same, a place created by love, where beauty could flourish in the most unexpected setting. On the 10th anniversary of Rose's arrival in Taylorsville, Thomas surprised her with a special concert. The entire town turned out, along with visitors from as far as San Francisco who had heard of the famous Violin Lady of Colorado. Rose, now in her 30s but still slender and graceful, wore a gown of deep green silk. Her hair, once a rich auburn, now showed threads of silver at the temples that she made no effort to hide. As she stepped onto the stage that evening, violin in hand, she paused to look out at the audience. In the front row sat Thomas, his hair likewise touched with gray but his eyes as clear and direct as the day they had first met. Beside him were William and Catherine, dressed in their Sunday best, their faces shining with pride for their mother. Behind them was the community that had become her family. Mrs. Peterson, now using a cane but still sharp-witted. Sarah Miller and her husband, the ranch hands who had helped build the stage. Newcomers to Taylorsville who had only heard stories of Rose's arrival with nothing but a violin and determination. 10 years ago, Rose began, her voice carrying easily through the barn. I stepped off a stagecoach, a stranger in a strange land. I had lost everything I thought mattered: my home, my parents, my place in the world. All I had was my violin and the music I could make with it. She smiled, looking directly at Thomas. And then I met a man who saw possibility where others might have seen only a lost city girl, a man who built me a stage when I had nowhere to play. Thomas ducked his head slightly, still uncomfortable with praise even after all these years. Music is about connection, Rose continued. It's about finding harmony in unexpected places, beauty in simplicity, joy in the everyday moments. That's what Taylorsville has taught me. That's what my family has given me. She lifted her violin. This first piece was the one I played the night Thomas first heard me, through an open window at Mrs. Peterson's boarding house. It began our story. And as the first notes of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata filled the air, Rose closed her eyes, transported back to that night when a dusty, travel-worn young woman had sought solace in music, not knowing that a cowboy was listening in the street below, already dreaming of building her a stage. In the audience, Thomas watched his wife play, remembering the girl who had arrived with just a violin and found a home in his heart. The music washed over him, as fresh and moving as it had been that first night. Life had not always been easy in these 10 years. There had been drought years when the ranch struggled, winters when illness swept through the town, arguments and misunderstandings as any couple might have. But through it all, the music had continued in their home, in the barn, in the legacy they were creating together. As Rose finished the piece and moved seamlessly into the next, Thomas glanced at his children, William intent on his mother's fingering, already thinking like a musician, Catherine swaying slightly to the rhythm, her eyes dreamy. This, Thomas thought, was the true stage he had built, not the wooden platform where Rose stood, but the life they had constructed together, note by note, day by day. A life filled with music and love, with challenges overcome and joys shared. And as the violin sang out under the touch of the woman he loved, Thomas Sutton knew that it was the most beautiful thing he had ever created.